Chair Stevens, we're ready to begin.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So I will call to order this work session of the State Aviation Board. This is a work session for the board with agency staff. Attendees from the public are welcome to observe. The chat function as well as the attendee cameras and microphones will be turned off. If you would like to submit public comment, please do that through the ODAB website for the October 3rd board meeting. And with that, I will turn it back over for roll call.
All right, thank you, Chair Stevens. Sarah Lucas.
Present.
Bill Groff. I do see you in there, Bill. You should be able to unmute now. Okay, we'll come back to Bill. Brian Frank.
All right, it worked. I got it. It's unmuted.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
I'm here.
Brian's present.
All right, thank you. Catherine Stevens.
Present.
And then Jeff Pritchard, I just got an email from him this morning. He will be absent. He is out fighting a fire. Is this absence excused, Chair Stevens?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Steve Nagy.
Present.
And Jim Knight.
Present.
All right, thank you so much. And then if the ODAV staff online could please introduce themselves, please state your name and department.
Okay, and I can start. Kristen Forrest, I'm the finance manager.
Good morning. Beach, the state airports manager.
Andrea Abrahamson, program and planning coordinator.
Alex Thomas, policy planning and programs manager.
Brandon Pike, aviation planner.
Remy Bunkel, programs and contracts coordinator.
All right, am I the only one left?
I think so.
So Kenji Sugihara, director. Now, Catherine, can I say a couple words before we get started?
Yeah, yes, please do.
So I just want to say hello from Las Vegas at the Commercial UAV Conference, where I'm also here in support of these folks. Here's Joseph, he's saying hi from the UAS Accelerator out in Pendleton. Yep. So if you want to take a look, I will show. Oh, and Andrew.
I'm the executive director. It's great to be with all of you today.
Yeah, so take a look around. It's Oregon and then Pendleton. So just want to say hi, and I'll be in the background listening. So I will let staff and the board, Catherine, take it away.
All right, thank you, Kenji. So we will hop right into the next item on the agenda, which is the board best practice survey information. And Kristen.
Okay, great. So I will share my screen. Okay, can you all see my screen now? Okay, great. So I just have a short presentation for you today. I wanted to tell you about the Aviation Board Best Practice Survey. Since we have a lot of new board members, this is new to some of you, and some of you have been through this last year. So I will be sending out a survey to you either today or tomorrow. And this is the Board Best Practice Survey. So it's one of our KPMs, which is our key performance measures. And we do this survey every year with the board. We have 15 questions that we ask. And we get these questions from LFO, and DAS developed them. And so they're the same questions for all boards in Oregon. So they're measuring the executive director selection expectations and feedback, strategic management, strategic policy development, fiscal oversight, and board management. And so they came up with the questions for us so we can add more questions to the next survey next time if we want to, but the new questions don't be counted with the totals. So these specific questions are what is required to be measured for this KPM. So I wanted to go over the questions with you, and that way you have a chance to ask any questions about the questions. before you get the survey. So these are the 15 questions. And after the survey, I will just average all of your answers. So the first two are about the executive director. So that the performance expectations are current and that the director receives annual performance feedback. So last month was Kenji's month to do the annual performance feedback. So a survey did go out for that, and data was gathered to send to the Chief Human Services Office of the state. The next one is that the current and applicable. The next one is that the board reviews the annual performance progress report. So this is an annual report that we put together for all of our KPMs. And so the board will get to review that in fall. So I'll do a presentation for the board with all of those KPMs for you. And then Alexis, if anybody has questions, please let me know because I can't see them on my, so if anyone raises their hand, let me know. Awesome. Okay, thank you. The next one is that the board is appropriately involved in the review of the agency's key communications. The board is appropriately involved in policy-making activities. Number 7 is that the agency's policy option packages are aligned with their mission and goals. And so as a review, these are the POPs that you voted on a couple of months ago at the board meeting. So right now, the 3 POPs that we're putting into our budget are all of the general aviation entitlement projects, the software for our aircraft registration, commercial insurance. The next one is that the board reviews all proposed budgets. So the board does review the agency request budget, the governor's budget, and then the legislatively adopted budget every other year. And then the board also does vote on the legislatively adopted budget. So that is every odd numbered year, you'll vote on that so that we can use that budget. The next one is the board periodically reviews key financial information and audit findings. So if we have any audits or any key financial information that is presented to the board, the director is appropriately accounting for resources. The agency adheres to accounting rules and other financial controls. So we do abide by the Oregon accounting rules, and we do put together accounting reports every fiscal year to make sure that we are following all of the accounting standards for the state. Board members act in accordance with their roles as public representatives. The board coordinates with others where responsibilities and interests overlap. The board members identify and attend appropriate training sessions, and the board reviews its management practices. Usually we do that in the fall during the strategic session. So those are the 15 questions. Does anyone have any questions about those questions? So I will be sending everybody the survey. It's through SurveyMonkey. So you'll see an email from me either today or tomorrow. And you have a couple of weeks to complete it. So I'll remind you if you don't get it done. And it is anonymous. And you do have a chance to put in comments if you'd like to. And then I'll put together the survey information. So it goes into our key performance measure report. And so that does go into our budget. It goes to legislature. It goes to DAS, CFO, and LFO. Okay, if we don't have any questions, that is all I have. So I will stop sharing my screen now. And that is all I have for you.
Okay, any questions for Kristen on that? Through here. Okay, I don't see questions. The UAO, BPD, and rulemaking update with Tony.
Good morning. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah. So good morning. I'm going to give an update on the VPD's vehicle and pedestrian deviations at the Aurora State Airport and our rulemaking that we started back in 22. I've kept this topic in my regular board information updates, but I wanted to go into a little more detail and just keep it on your radar because we will be bringing the rulemaking back to the board for a vote. So I will go into that now. First, just a quick overview of the Aurora State Airport. It has changed quite a bit over the last 30 years. It's grown tremendously. These are just some historical satellite images that I pulled off of Google Earth since '94. And this is a figure from, I'm sorry, was there a question? Right. This is a figure from our current master planning process, and it shows the state property, which encompasses the runway and the parallel taxiway, as well as aprons and this portion of landside development on the east side of the airfield. The property line is shown by this dashed line, and these darker shaded areas are private property that have through the fence access. There are also these non-shaded areas on the north and south end that have, they're independent of the Aurora State Airport. They are their own separate heliports that operate independent of the This is what's controlled by the air traffic control tower. And then the blue is what's not controlled by the air traffic control tower. And you can see along the east edge of the parallel taxiway, where they're very close, our property line and that movement line are almost overlapping. I'm going to go into more detail on that here in just a minute. In 2009, in the late 2000s, we relocated our parallel taxiway. It had to go farther away from the runway, and we had to acquire property in order to do that. And this picture on the left shows what the taxiway configuration was in 2004, and then in May in 2010 in the center image, and it shows that taxiway shift that occurred. The picture on the right is from our 2012 airport layout plan, and it shows that taxiway object-free area as the blue line, and this red line as our property line. And again, the two almost overlapping. Off of our property is the runway object-free area shown by this black line. The airport became controlled in 2015 when the air traffic control tower was finished. And this is a picture just before it was completed in April of 2015. And you can see on the top left here that we did not have a movement line or a non-movement area boundary marking. And then in the center, in July of 2016, the tower was operational and we had installed those. The center image is of our property, the aprons and taxi lane connectors on our property where we installed the marking. And then on the right over here is the south end along through the fence where the movement line was installed just adjacent to our property line. And then on the north is through as well. This is what that looks like on the ground. This is looking from the very south end, from that little corner of our property on the south, looking north. And you can see this yellow dashed line is the property line. And then you can see the very freshly repainted non-movement area boundary marking that was done this summer. And just the proximity of those two markings, the lack of space for operating or positioning around all the parked aircraft. And this is something I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. But, VPDs at Aurora. The FAA defines a vehicle or pedestrian deviation as an entry or movement on the airport movement area or safety area by a vehicle operator or pedestrian that has not been authorized by air traffic control, and that includes surface incidents involving aircraft operated by non-pilots, such as anyone. We have had at least one VPD meeting that last part of the description where a mechanic was taxiing an aircraft not intended for flight, and it was categorized as a VPD. They're also one version of a surface incident. There are other categories of surface incidents, including pilot deviations and operational incidents from air traffic controllers. So looking at the numbers when the air traffic control tower opened in late 2015, I don't have any data for 2015, but we have 20 VPDs in 2016, and then a gradual decline. But that was a fairly significant amount. And the runway incursions were also VPDs, but they were more than a surface incident. These were within the runway safety area. And they are in addition to, so the total is with 5 runway incursions, and then with 59 surface incidents, we have a total of 64 VPDs over the last 8 years. Going into the types of VPDs, 44 of those were by vehicles, 20 of those were pedestrians, 3 of them conflicted with air traffic operations. So an aircraft had to go around, they had to go a missed approach, or stop their taxi on the ground because of a pedestrian or vehicle on the movement area. Just some common themes, and I have the full breakdown, and it's from the FAA. If anyone from the board would like to take a look at that full breakdown, I'm happy to share it. But these were just some common themes among those 64 VPDs. Pedestrians, walking dogs. Kenji, Carl is innocent for now. Haven't had any cats reported. But vehicles or pedestrians positioning around life flight aircraft, and I'm going to go into that, why that is specifically a common theme here in just a minute as well. And delivery vehicles who are unfamiliar with the airport, guests of the airport, of airport users that are unfamiliar with the airport, and then airport users assisting disabled aircraft, airport users taking shortcuts to airport destinations, and airport users who are unaware the tower was on operation. We've had a couple of those people who knew better. They fully understand the need to contact tower, get clearance, but was not aware that tower had opened in between hopping out of maybe the fuel truck or the tug, and proceeded back onto the taxiway once tower had opened for the morning. In January of 2023, the FAA, their certification inspectors came to do a site visit at the airport, and they produced a list of their findings and recommendations, and those are summarized below. There were 9 recommendations, and they were to develop driver's training with specific to non-movement access and movement area driver's training and escort procedures, to develop and implement rules and regulations for the airport, to develop a plan to implement and educate tenants about rules and regulations and training, ensure enforcement for violations are adhered to, keep all gates closed to prevent inadvertent entry, evaluate the installation of a vehicle service road in the non-movement area, install standard markings, develop a program to refresh markings when faded, install standard taxiway edge lighting or reflectors, and add a taxiway direction and location signs, as well as a vehicle service road stop sign, and improve signage at the gates. There were 3 other non-standard items that were found, including that the property for the runway object-free area for the C2, which is the design standard for our airport, we don't fully own all of the property within the runway object-free area. They also found that in their records that no approved modification to standard is on file for that non-standard condition. And then they found an airport sign and aircraft parking spot within the runway object-free area. Just some of the steps and mitigations that we've implemented to date. Starting in 2017, we have installed tower cameras. We've added stencil text to the non-movement area boundary marking. We've added signage to gates and on the airfield. We have conducted outreach and discuss VPDs monthly in public meetings such as PAM. And we have distributed one-page flyers to all the airport businesses and users. And we've added placards to each of the gate keypads so that when you're entering the code, you're presented with that information. We have closed the 2 gates that we own and operate at the Aurora Airport. They were left open during business hours, but we've closed those to prevent inadvertent entry. We started rulemaking in 2022. We've updated markings, and we are still in the process of developing driver's training to implement along with that rulemaking. Just a couple visuals for what that looks like. This is photos and screenshots from videos from the camera on top of the air traffic control tower. The top left image is an individual who stepped over the line and to get a photo op with the aircraft. The photo on the top right is a vehicle that was positioning around these parked aircraft. These are the life flight parking spots that are within the runway object free area that make it very difficult to get around without going onto the movement area. And that's why that was such a common theme that I mentioned earlier. On the top or the very bottom picture is on the north end of a person positioning around this fence that was put up with a gate blocking this access between 2 different private properties. And I'm going to explain that here in another minute as well. Here are some visuals of the stencil text and signage and the gate placards that we installed. And the 1-page flyer, and notice about the gate closure that we did back in 22 as well. And some of the markings we've refreshed. The markings were quite faded, and back in September of 22, we went and refreshed the non-movement area boundary marking. And then this summer of 24, we've completed our surface seal and markings project, where all of the markings on state property were refreshed and brought up to standard. It included some other improvements like widening the non-movement area boundary marking from 6 inches to 12 inches. We also included the green markings in the island for better visibility and to distinguish those as non-usable as well. So coming back to this image, I mentioned that we had closed the 2 gates that ODAV operates, and one of those is the blue gate here on our property. The other is the purple gate, which is on private property, but we have an easement for the maintenance and operation of that gate. So those 2 gates we've closed. The green gate over here and some of the other gates on leading to private property are left open still. And so that can continue to be a challenge if those gates are left open. I'm going to go into a little bit about the through the fence requirements here in a moment. I do want to highlight that the through the fence properties have made some improvements as well. They have installed internal gates on the north end where their perimeter gate is left open, but these internal gates are proving to be effective in preventing inadvertent entry for vehicles from the north end. So really happy to see the steps they've taken to be proactive and try to get a handle on the VPDs. On the south end, similarly, they've installed some traffic controls, and they've also installed markings along on their portion of the property line, trying to communicate to people not to cross over that non-movement area boundary marking. And so again, just really happy to see the steps they've taken. However, the VPDs, as you saw from our graph, have continued over the last couple of years. On our through the fence agreements, we only allow for aircraft to use the access point, which is the boundary of the private property onto state property. It's again exclusively for the movement of aircraft and personnel that are authorized by ODAV. And no other uses of that access point is permitted. We do put the responsibility on the through the fence permittee to maintain the access point in a safe condition. And it's their responsibility to post the property and the access point against trespassing, and to exercise control over the access point to prevent the unauthorized use of that access point. If they're in default, if they're not meeting this requirement, the default language is a little bit vague, in my opinion. It's not the strongest, and it kind of leads to some pretty severe remedies, where if they can't remedy the default within 30 days, they must remedy as soon as practicable. They must start within 30 days and then remedy as soon as practicable. And if they don't, then our remedy, ODAV's remedy, is to remove or occupy any property of either the permittee or permittee's unit owners, to deny the permittee or unit owners any rights under the agreement, or to terminate the agreement. And these are pretty extreme. We have not approached any of our through the fence permittees with any of these remedies. We're really focusing on trying to work collaboratively and find other solutions to VPDs. And that's also where we implemented or started the rulemaking process back in 2022 to create penalties and violations for VPDs. So that initiated back in 2019 when the legislature approved Senate Bill 54, which gave ODAV authority to impose fines for VPDs at state airports with a control tower. The only state airport with a control tower is the Aurora State Airport. Again, it was approved in 2019. Since 2019 through 2021, we only had one VPD occur. So that rulemaking process was not a high priority. Starting in 2022, a series of VPDs prompted temporary and for immediate rulemaking, and then we also initiated a permanent rulemaking for enforcement. The temporary rule established violations and civil penalties up to $2,500 per occurrence. The board approved this temporary rule in June 2022. The rule was in effect from June through December 22, but 0 violations or penalties were issued. And mostly because it's not because we didn't have VPDs in that period, but mostly because during our permanent rulemaking process that we started, there was just a lot of public comment and concerns over the amount. And again, we haven't been trying to take a very harsh approach with this, and where our goal has been to work collaboratively with the airport users to prevent VPDs. So we didn't issue violations during that period. We, at that same June 22 board meeting, the board authorized the initiation for a permanent rulemaking, which we did start. The rulemaking advisory committee comprised of airport users was established, and we filed public notice for the permanent rule. The public comment period was open until October 21st, 22. The public hearing was held on October 20th, 22. And the feedback that we got from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and from those public meetings and comments were primarily based on the need for a driver's training program. They're over concerns over the penalty amounts being excessive in the commenters' opinions, and need for clarification on the definition of responsible party and who would be in violation or penalized. The rulemaking has been on pause since, pending the development of the driver's training program that we again plan to implement alongside together with the rulemaking. So next steps, we are still working on the driver's training program. We are hoping to implement that later this year, and so we would implement the final edits to the non-moving area training, which we would finalize with input from airport users, and that would be distributed to everyone. We're also going to implement a movement area driver's training for those that ODAV will authorize into the movement area, and that will be conducted only by ODAV. But we'll implement both of these programs with all airport users. And then the rulemaking, we will have another public meeting on updates and edits to the proposed rulemaking based on the feedback that we received back in 2022. And we will plan to bring this to the board with an update and ask to adopt that rulemaking. So at that point, we would implement enforcement for violations. We're also looking at facility improvements in the ongoing master plan. We're looking at access, ways to improve or mitigate VPDs by changing access to the airport, layout improvements, adding a vehicle service road, which the PAC has asked for, and through additional signage and lighting improvements as well. Any questions?
I'm looking for hands
Sarah?
up. There's Sarah.
Hey, Tony, thank you for that good update. Just was curious if you had any target dates for implementation of that driver's training.
We don't. I'm really personally aiming for this fall. Would love to bring this to the December board meeting. I've missed prior deadlines for a couple of different reasons. This is a high priority, and workload permitting, that's my personal goal.
Okay, thank you.
Steve?
Kind of on a similar question, Tony, do you have a timeline for implementing the implementation and the physical limitations for restricting some of these access points and the large access areas, similar to how you guys painted that island to narrow the access?
Yeah, so on the rulemaking and driver's training side, definitely aiming for end of this year. The physical changes, I don't have a good time frame for that. We are looking at that in the master plan. We're having conversations with the private property owners with through the fence access. We spoke about those islanding on the south end where there's a big continuous access point, and where those conversations are ongoing. I just don't have a time frame for those yet.
Tony, I have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
So one is back when we were taking a look at the kind of the property line being right near the movement, non-movement line. And there was that dashed line showing the property line. Is that a non-standard marking?
It is not an intermediate hold marking, so yes.
And I'm wondering if that might be adding to the confusion, because I haven't ever seen that marking before. So, and I don't know if there's a reason why we really have to paint a line where the property line is.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
It is. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
It is unusual. I hadn't seen that before starting here with ODAV myself, and it's something that the through the fencers really appreciate because it does delineate the difference from the state property and their property. I think the use of that particular marking is maybe not helpful because I think it can add to some confusion. We did refresh it in the summer, this summer during our project because it was a maintenance project and we just refreshed what we had. But I agree, we can certainly look at something more distinguishable.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised that the inspector didn't call that one out. I'm assuming that at some point in time that was approved by the FAA, even standard marking, but it does seem odd to me. I've never seen that one. And then you talked about one of the recommendations from the cert inspector was airport rules. So does Aurora have minimum standards but not airport rules?
We have, in fact, I'll share my screen once more. We do have minimum standards and we do have rules. I meant to include that. In Oregon Administrative Rule, Chapter 738, Division 50, we have the Aurora State Airport Aircraft Operation Regulations, and it covers taxiing. It's fairly brief, landing and takeoff, airport traffic patterns, helicopters, gliders, balloons, parachutists, ultralight aircraft, agricultural application, and then at miscellaneous, there's one relevant section here that motor vehicles shall not be operated on the runway or parallel taxiway without specific prior authorization by the director of the department. So we do have a rule specific to VPDs already, but from conversations we had with those inspectors that gave that recommendation, they were interested in seeing more robust local airport rules and regulations that from their recommendation, would provide more kind of teeth for enforcement.
Yeah, I agree with that suggestion that they have as to maybe it's time for an edit on those rules and standards and maybe consideration for putting it all into one document and then taking a look at how you're disseminating those as well. I know just at my airport that helped a lot when we did an update and just got better about disseminating that information early and often. And then as far as the driver's training, will that be for all airport users, and how will you enforce that for through the fence people?
So there's two different portions of driver's training that we're looking to implement. The non-movement portion is what we are going to share with all airport users, including the through the fence groups. And we're also going to share with them before it's finalized so we can get their input. If there's any suggestions they have, we'll consider those. And that we will share, publish on our website, broadcast anywhere, everywhere, for everyone to be aware of best practices and our requirements for operating within the fence at the Aurora State Airport. Anyone will have access to that. The movement area portion, I do not want to provide a way for someone to get confused and have access to a movement area training and then misunderstand that might grant them or they believe they have the ability to go onto the movement area. We are going to conduct that movement training directly, and we're going to keep a list of who is authorized and do recurrent training for those individuals. And as required by the OR we have that I just read to you.
Okay. Any other questions on this for Tony? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you, Tony. Appreciate that update.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, we will move on to the COAR grant execution timeframes. And Andrea.
Thank you, Chair Stevens and Aviation Board. Let me just get my presentation up. So for, today for COAR, we just have a quick presentation to ask the board for some input regarding our COAR execution guidelines, whether we should allow grants to continue pending or whether we need to have a requirement for when they are canceled and reapplied for in a subsequent grant cycle. So we do have multiple grantees with unexecuted grants. The three I have listed here, there is nothing negative about them. I just want to make that clear. It's just to show an example of just a few of our grantees that do have these pending, and they have various reasons for why they've been delayed. Program coordinators contact periodically by email to request the status of unexecuted grants. And so we keep documentation on all of that. It's also a way for us to figure out if there is assistance that we can offer to the grantees in order to get these executed. The biggest issue is there is a statutory consideration in the application process which the question is, the project ready for construction or implementation? And this was a question that was required by the legislature when the program was created to help score and rank the projects to be approved. So, for instance, the question gives timeframes that the grantees can choose. So it's ready for construction or implementation within 0 to 6 months, 7 to 12 months, etc. And the shorter time frame that the project is ready in, the higher score the system allocates to the application. And additionally, the Aviation Review Committee also looks at this, and it can affect the ranking of their submission to the Aviation Board for approval. So with Priority 1 grants, the FAA matches, that may not be as big of an issue, but when it comes down to the Priority 2 or 3, it can determine whether an application is above or below the approval cut line. So other than that statutory consideration, the considerations that program coordinators have been talking about probably for about the last year is, what is a reasonable time frame to expect the core grants to be executed? And again, should this requirement be the same for Priority 1 versus Priority 2 and 3 grants? One of the biggest issues, a delay in execution for Priority 1, of course, could be delays caused by the FAA, and those are things that our grantees don't necessarily have control over. So we want to definitely recognize that and the times when it is not a grantee issue. So again, what's the reason for the delay? And then what is the possibility that this application could be reapproved in a future cycle? For Priority 1, again, it's a greater likelihood that it could be reapproved, but for Priority 2 and 3, it always depends on what our available funding is. So as mentioned, program coordinators have been discussing this off and on for about the last year. We have a new batch of grants that will be approved in less than 6 months, and so we really would like to get some kind of guideline in place so that we can help these grants move forward through execution, so we can kind of determine when it is more appropriate to just have them cancel. How is this affecting the revenue in the program? These are all things we've kind of been thinking about, and so we wanted to bring it to the board and get your input on it. Definitely happy to take any comments or questions right now, and then additionally, I'll send out an email after the meeting with all of this information if you'd like to provide any written response back on it, if you'd like some time to think about it, and then we can compile this and bring it back at a later board meeting to kind of finalize. So are there any questions right now on this one?
So, Andrea, I know you touched on this a little bit, but is there a common theme of why that these are not being executed, or is it really a variety of things, whether it's matching funds or the FAA holdups, or?
Again, for the Priority 1s, the majority, I would say, are FAA caused delays. There have been issues with procurement that may have caused delays in other priorities. It just really can be various reasons.
Jim has a question.
So Andrea, I'm not entirely clear what you're asking of the board. Are you asking for the guidelines to give staff some guidance on whether or not to extend, or are we creating rules of which will allow for an extension?
We have talked about whether this is something that should be put into rule. Our thoughts are that because there can be many reasons why it's not necessarily the grantee's issue that caused the delay, I don't know that rule would be the best place to put it. So I think to start out, we would more be looking for a procedure, and we're asking the board for their input or thoughts on what is an appropriate time frame for these grants to be executed. Ideally, of course, it would be before the next grant cycle starts up or before the next batch of grants are approved so that we can continue to keep things moving forward, but it's not necessarily realistic. So we really wanted to hear from you all what your thoughts are on that.
So
Jim, just for some,
yeah, go ahead.
just for some reference point too. I mean, we still have, a grant from 2021 that has not been executed yet. And so for us, it's just how long do we want to keep a grant that's been approved within the cycle rather than just reaching a certain point at 2, 3, whatever years and basically canceling it ourselves and then just saying, apply it during the next cycle.
Yeah, it would seem to me that it's going to be difficult to come up with guidance because each grant is different. There's going to be different reasons for why they're not able to do it. And you've mentioned a couple, so FAA grants, there can certainly be delays at the FAA level, and that's really not, I would say automatically for those that are delayed by the FAA, they should be extended until those issues are worked out with the FAA. On items of which there is problems in the supply chain process, that becomes a little bit more complicated because is it the provider that's the problem, or was it the oversight of the provider by the grantee is the problem? And then in grants of which they just haven't simply got around to doing these grants, that's a whole other can of worms. And I would feel different about each one of those categories of what's causing the delay. And Tony, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing this 2021 grant, which it's not on the list that's in front of us.
It's not one of the ones I included on here, but it is an FAA. It's a priority one, and I believe it was one that had BIL funding. So again, there's when it comes to the BIL funding, the COAR program had to make some changes, which is what we did with our rulemaking in the past year for that one. But there also have been some other issues more related to FAA and environmental, that sort of thing with that grant as well.
So let me go back to my first question. Is what you're looking for is the guidance for the staff to make the decision of whether or not to pull the plug on a grant? Or are we looking for a process of which the board is engaged on a specific grant and say, well, okay, are we going to make a decision as a board whether or not to grant an extension? I mean, those are two different things. So
sure. And yes, what we're asking here specifically would be guidance for staff in determining when a grant should be left to pend or be canceled. So the board wouldn't be brought in to make that decision unless possibly the grantee, we wanted to cancel, say, and the grantee wanted to dispute that. We could bring it to the board and have the board take a look at it.
Okay, that helps clear it up as what's the parameters of the decision that we're trying to make today.
Sure.
Other board members, do you have some input into this? Because I kind of want to think about this for a few moments at least before I just, off the top of my head, come up with some suggestions. But I'd sure like to hear
Jim,
the board.
I think, sorry. I was going to say, I think the questions you've been asking are kind of spot on about where the delays come from, and are they things that are beyond the control of the airport sponsor, or are they things, the airport sponsor couldn't come up with their own funding at this time? That's something that is within their control. But I think, delays in FAA grants or delays in supply or materials certainly would be part of any criteria. I agree. The questions you're asking are the right ones.
And Brian?
Is there any verbiage in the application process that notify applicants that they would be dropped out of for over budget, over time, lack of communication, that kind of stuff?
There is not anything specifically in the application that addresses that. There is some in rule and there is some in the grant agreement, but of course, if they haven't executed the grant agreement, that wouldn't apply yet.
So Andrea, I'm just
might
thinking around the Connect Oregon grant process, and there is a timeline that you must complete the construction on those projects. I think it's about 3 years, so there is some flexibility. It's either 2 or 3, I can't remember exactly. There is some flexibility in there. But I think we all need to keep in mind, to be able to apply for this grant, you need, usually they're all tied to FAA funding as a match, right? So you would have already had to have completed your environmental. As you noted, we got thrown a wrench in with a different interpretation on an environmental regulation. So that is a legitimate delay now that FAA is working through. But matching funds, that's a requirement to also have your matching funds identified. And so then if that's the issue, I think what Jim was talking about is right. It really depends on what's the excuse. If it's legitimately a delay by the FAA or some new environmental regulation that has delayed progress, it's different than if it's a sponsor organization wound up not having the grant match or something like that. Does somebody else have another question or comment?
Yeah, I think a lot of the board input's been great. We did a Connect grant that when we did the environmental assessment, it got phenomenally drawn out. And so as staff, just first going through, is it an external delay or is it the applicant internal? And how much did they hope and how much did they have planned? And I would say that if things are need to be over budget by X% or other things have changed on them, that would be a reconsideration for application or just lack of movement and update. So if you had more just communication protocol with the applicants, then that would help you with your decision, because it seems like each one of these is going to be a case by case and there'll be something strange going on.
Thank you. Yes, that's definitely true. They all have their different peculiarities.
Go ahead, Bill.
I think about this as being a past elected official. When we do taxpayer bonds, you get 2 years to spend 85% of the money from the time you start charging taxpayers for the money. But there's a policy around that. And so I know we're talking about individual look at this and that, but at a policy level, what I would suggest to staff is that for each course cycle, you have a process and a separate category for people who need to extend to provide the proper information that staff needs, and then have that as a category during each cycle and have that in the grant application, that if you're still delayed or whatever, you have a process and here's the information you need to apply at the next course cycle. And if it's not approved, then your grant is canceled. And if it is approved because you've completed the valid application for an extension on that cycle, then staff can approve it and just list out the kind of things we're talking about here, but allow that process for that every grant applicant that is awarded a grant, they know in the process that in the next grant cycle, if they still have not used the funds, this is the information that need to be provided for a discussion on continuation of the grant or not.
Jim, did you have additional comments?
Yeah, Bill, that's really good input. The first thing that comes to mind, Andrea, is that these decisions that we're going to be making for these grants, the instructions need to be updated in the COAR process. so that the grantees really understand right up front, you know, the time constraints that are imposed upon them and the decision-making process if there needs to be an extension for whatever the reasons are. I would say, well, let me ask a question. When you find out that one of the grantees aren't going to be able to make it on the time schedule as originally agreed, are they providing that information to you in writing, or is that mostly verbal?
Typically it is in writing because we will reach out by email. We want to be able to have that documentation that we can save in the grant file.
So at some point there needs to be more of a formal warning to the applicant that they're in danger of losing their funding and giving them time to, one, respond, but two, get back on track with a new schedule that would be acceptable within that grant, within, you know, the confines of that specific grant. Bill makes a really good point in that we would sure like to know, as you're moving into the next COAR cycle, which of these funds are all of a sudden going to become available to new grants. So I can see that not fulfilling grant responsibilities in prior grants does kind of, you know, it impacts the future of funding cycles. So there does need to be a drop dead date of yes or no, you're going to make it or you're not going to make it. So how I think that would be helpful, Andrea, is that perhaps you would send us as the board, here's how we would like to do this. Here's the process that we would like to engage with. And I think that's probably a better way of doing it than having the board kind of come up with some new instructions or rules for you. Have we given you enough input at this point that you could move forward with that?
Yes, definitely. I can put together, just based on these comments and the discussions we've had internally as well, a process and send it out to you all, and then you can reply with any comments or suggestions on it.
So I would say, for, you know, starting with the FAA, is that there should be a letter from the FAA to the grantee that they could share with us as where is FAA on their funding of that specific grant. When it comes to decision making because of the problems within the supply chain, then there really needs to be some documentation that you could verify that documentation is true and accurate. If it's an internal problem, you know, and I know that happens. Well, we lost our airport director, or the staff person who was overseeing this project is no longer there, and we're in a hiring process. You know, if that's the issue, and I think that probably comes up occasionally. Again, there should be an associated timeline with that, as when is that all going to be solved? But I'm really, you know, I have to tell you, I'm not real clear. How do we what's the date we would need to pull plugs on grants so that we could make those funds available to new potential grantees? That part I'm not real clear about.
And I would just tweak one piece of what Jim said, is I think it should just be some kind of communication from the FAA. Often they don't want to write letters. But sometimes they'll tell you in an email. And then also I'm assuming that even if a grant application is dropped for non-execution, the sponsor organization could reapply for those grant funds.
Correct, yes.
Any other questions, comments, direction for Andrea? Okay, thanks.
No, thank you for this update.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we are moving right along, so we will go to the PEP PMP budget update with also Andrea.
So me. Okay, so yes, to switch gears a little bit, We wanted to give you a update on our PEP, PMP budgets and just kind of where we are in those processes. So our fuel tax revenue typically provides about $1 million in revenue per year to the pavement evaluation and maintenance programs. During the pandemic, the pavement programs received reduced revenue, and additionally in 2021, PMP work became no longer eligible under FAA funding. Prior to that, our airport sponsors where we were doing the PMP work could use their NPEs to help cover their sponsor match of the PMP work. Additionally, during the pandemic, there was staffing changes and other issues that led us to getting behind on our PEP and PMP cycles. So typically we would have the pavement evaluation done 1 year and then the maintenance or construction work on it done the following year. But we've had some delay in that, and we want to be able to catch up because it's important to get the pavement taken care of so that the issues are not increasing between the time the evaluation was done and the construction work was done. So we've been working on a catch-up schedule, but because of that decrease in revenue, we have difficulty in funding all the needed work. And so what we're planning on doing for PMP work in 2025 and 2026 is to apply for a COAR grant on behalf of the PMP program to cover the sponsor matches for the airports. So just to get a little bit more into the PMP program, the goal of PMP is to protect Oregon's airport investments by preserving airfield pavement through preventative maintenance to extend the life of pavement infrastructure. PMP work is based on the Pavement Condition Index, or PCI rating of pavement provided through the Pavement Evaluation Program. And it's necessary to keep the PCI above a critical value. And the critical PCI is considered the point at which the pavement condition begins to deteriorate more quickly over time. As this information was brought up in the PMP 10-year study, which was done back in 2012, and it showed that as the condition deteriorates to a worse state, major maintenance and rehabilitation is triggered because the cost to apply localized maintenance and rehabilitation increases significantly. So without adequate funding to catch up and fully fund the PMP work, it's likely to see an increase in those critical PCI values and an increase in maintenance costs for the airports. So just a brief synopsis of our plan to catch up and get all this work completely funded. As mentioned, the PMP program receives about $1 million in revenue per year, and that is what is considered the budget for that year as well. Typically, the sponsor match is based on the airport category, and if you're familiar with COAR, it's the same anywhere from 5% up to 35% match, I believe. But the majority of airports we find are at the 10% sponsor match requirement. So we would be looking at a $100,000 COAR request per region. We would split our requests between 2 COAR cycles. So we would ask for $200,000 in this upcoming cycle for Region 1 and Region 2 PMP. And then we would ask for an additional $200,000 in the next cycle to complete Region 3 and Region 4 PMP. Once the cycles are complete, of course, any funds would be returned back to the COAR program as is a normal procedure for all of our grantees. That would not be at the end of both of these grants, but it would be each cycle. So once Region 1 and 2 were complete, any additional funds would go back to the COAR program. Why we're looking for the COAR program as a solution at the moment is COAR did receive reduced revenue during the pandemic as well, but the program funding remained stable due to no need to match FAA grants for 2 years in 2020 and 2021. And additionally, the closure of the Aurora program, which was a previous grant program, and that revenue was transferred to COAR. So we've been able to keep, as I mentioned, the funding stable and provide for our COAR grantees. We don't consider this to be a long-term solution for PMP, but we would like to see about continuing to cover sponsor matches as much as possible. And so our 2 requests in this presentation are for board input on their thoughts continuing to cover the sponsor matches, And then, of course, we are always looking for ideas for funding for our programs. So I'll open it up right now if there are any questions or comments on this.
All right, any questions, Sarah?
Yes. So I know you guys are dealing with a difficult issue with the changes in the funding, and I appreciate your creativity, but I'm curious, have you asked any of the airport sponsors what their thoughts are on this? I know it's really necessary to get the matching funds for PMP, but it is robbing from the pot of funds for other projects. And so that'd be my first question. And then my second one, just as a policy and outreach for the AIP program, has this been brought up at NASAO or any other organization on what other states are doing or any push at the federal level to get pavement maintenance eligible again?
So to answer your first question, we have not reached out to our COAR grantees or the airport sponsors yet in regards to this, but it is definitely something that we'll be looking for input on as well. Because of course the COAR cycle opens in about a month. We want to make sure that we're being proactive and starting to get moving on this, but also of course continuing to get input from our stakeholders in the board. The second one, Alex, do you have any idea on that? I also see James Kirby's got his hand up.
Go ahead, James.
Is he able to unmute himself?
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. So historically, back when FAA involvement was in place, we had a lot of great feedback from sponsors on the PMP match side, being able to use their NPEs as their matches for their work that they were doing at the airports. And yeah, that was a big void when we were unable to continue using those NPE funds for a number of reasons. So I think, you know, being able to have that skin in the game again in some form or another from those airports, whether that's, you know, in a manner of speaking, borrowing from a potential COAR request from that airport in another project in order to shift those funds to a PMP match, I think falls into that same sort of realm where there's that value that they're seeing there with the work they're getting. I think there's some management of expectations since the program has been kind of covering matches in recent history that we'd have to go back to. But I think that the sponsors definitely saw the value in using other grant funds that were available to them to cover those matches and kind of have that participation. So just thought I'd throw that out.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? I know one of your requests is looking for ideas for future funding of PMP. So I'm kind of wondering, I'm just going to throw it out there. Is it time, since, you know, this is not going to be covered by FAA any longer, yet it's still a requirement. Coming up with a 10% match for a really small GA airport can be really challenging, and PMP studies are not cheap. I'm wondering if there could be an economy of scale to have at least, perhaps, you know, we could do it in categories. It could be for non-commercial airports, all the GA airports, that there's a master contract for the state, and the state and ODAV actually owns that, and we put investment into that program, and perhaps there's an economy of scale there. And like I said, doing it on a rotation, that might actually be more money than, of course, this grant match. But I'm thinking it might actually save money overall for the PMP efforts, instead of having every individual airport having to contract their own PMP service. Other thoughts?
That's a Chair or Catherine, that's a great thought. I think I've asked, or I mean, maybe staff and the agency can come back to us and talk to us about that opportunity or the challenges with that. I mean, I think we all know what the challenges might be, but yeah, it would be nice to hear from Andrea and from the staff about that.
Mhm. James, did you have another thought on that?
I did. I wanted to clarify if I can address the chair real quick. I think what you're referring to or asking about is the pavement evaluation phase of the program where we're doing these individual evaluations at all the airports.
Okay.
Which that is a separate set of grants on that same cycle, but those are system planning grants through FAA. So they're coming from a different pot, and those matches are not. I mean, that match is an ODAV match at this point, and it has been historically. We haven't asked for skin in the game per se from the individual airport sponsors for those evaluation reports. So that's happening in the background.
Okay.
I think what we're talking about here for these core requests is actually the execution side of it. So the application of those pavement management funds to do the actual design and construction work in the field in each of those individual regions. So I think lumping those together into one, we lose some of our sort of specialty contractors when we lump all the regions together and try to gain additional economy of scale beyond our 4-region split. The folks that do this sort of PMP work are typically small contractors. They have lower bonding capacities. And that was one of the policies that was implemented by the agency many years ago now, was to split those into small geographically based or type of airport based contracts in order to make those more available to the specialty contractors who have those lower bonding capacities. And so historically, that's why we end up with, Region 3 has 2 contracts, 4 airports apiece at about $250,000 to $350,000 each in order for those contractors to access those. So the economy of scale, we actually find limits our bidding pool and actually can increase prices on the PMP side of the project.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on this? I guess the only other thing that might be useful, Andrea, is understanding how much that cuts into the core funding for other projects.
Sure. And so, of course, we're looking for 200,000 in each cycle, which is a little bit above our normal maximum request. Again, and we do, of course, let all of our grantees know this, that it is allowable to ask for more than the $150,000. And we're held to the same requirements as any grantee would be to provide the justification as to why we would be requesting that amount. And again, to provide the details and justification as to why this is appropriate for the core program, how it benefits the statewide air transportation system, and how it meets the goals of the program and the agency. And then, of course, regarding the amount itself, it was why I kind of wanted to bring up that, yes, the core program had reduced revenue during the pandemic, but was able to keep stable funding because of the reasons listed here. And so we feel comfortable that there is funding in the core program to provide this. That, yes, it may, in the core cycle, take away from a project another grantee has, but again, it is for the benefit of the public use airports and meets the goals of the core program.
So I guess what would be helpful probably for the board is if you would put together a proposal of a path forward on this, and then we can take a look at what your recommendation is.
Okay.
All right, any other questions, comments on this topic? All right, well, we are tracking right on time, so we will move on to the Aurora master plan updates.
I am going to do a quick introduction for Century West. They are our planners for the Aurora master plan. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves here in just a second. But I do want to ask, as they do this update to the board on our master plan, that we be respectful of the public process. All of the feedback we're getting from the PAC, we're just going through that now. We had a deadline for September 3rd for the PAC to get feedback to us on the alternatives that we shared, and are going to briefly go over here. The board, if you have any clarifying questions, by all means, Century West be happy to answer those. If you want to give input on the master plan, Catherine Stevens, Chair Stevens, is the PAC member for the board on the PAC. So please get your comments to Chair Stevens, and so that she can represent the board throughout the remainder of this PAC process. With that, I'll hand it over to Century West and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Tony. And good morning, Chair Stevens and board members. Thank you for this opportunity to present on the Aurora State Airport Master Plan project. My name is Matt Rogers. I am the project manager for the project. Also presenting today will be David Miller, the lead aviation planner for Century West. So David, if you can click to the next slide, we can go.
I just wanted to, yeah, thanks, Matt. I just want to double check. You are seeing my screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Let's go ahead.
So the agenda for today, we'll talk through introductions of the project team, the project schedule. We will go through the approved forecasts, the facility requirements process, a review of the preliminary alternatives, and then identify next steps. The website for the project, if you'd like more information, is listed here. So the project team includes the FAA as the lead agency for oversight and funding for the project. As you know, Oregon Department of Aviation is the airport owner and sponsor. Century West Engineering is the prime consultant for the planning elements of the project. We've got JLA engaged for public involvement, and a handful of specialty sub-consultants also on the team. David, the presentation just went away.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's a nice photo of your dog, though.
Oh, thanks. She's watching. Yeah, that now?
Okay. Yep, we've got it back. So with regard to the project schedule, the project began in the fall of 2021. It has been ongoing with an extensive forecast review process. That duration was more than a year and a half. And through that time, since the beginning of the project, we've also had 4 different FAA planners assigned to the project. And at each stage that a new planner comes in, there's a bit of time spent bringing the new planners up to speed on where we're at with the project and critical elements of the project. So just wanted to note that. The project has included extensive public involvement. We've had 6 PAC meetings to date, 2 open houses, 1 virtual and 1 in person. We've had 3 working sessions, which were follow-on meetings to the PAC meetings to provide additional explanation to the content that was presented in the PAC meetings, and also providing an overview of comments received and general responses to those comments. At this point, we have 2 PAC PAC meetings remaining in the project. And then we anticipate completing the project by the end of May 2025. And then following the FAA approval of the master plan, then it would come to the board for board approval and local adoption. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to David, and he's going to go through some specific details of the planning process.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to brief the board. So as Matt said, I'm David Miller. I'm the lead aviation planner for Century West, and I'm going to provide an overview of the forecast approval process, the key facility requirements findings, and some of the preliminary alternatives that we've been working with our advisory committee on. So as Matt mentioned, we had a fairly extensive, I'd say a significantly extensive review process with the FAA on the forecasts that extended from the typical Seattle Airport District office to headquarters by way of the regional office. So it's a little unusual for the level of interest for a general aviation airport, but as Matt said, that's what accounted for our lengthy review process. The FAA they weren't particularly focused on specifics for Aurora State Airport. They were really looking at it, especially at the headquarters level, about how those forecasts would compare to other airports like Aurora around the country. Real focus on model relevance, and really the growth rate was what was the most interest to the FAA. So the final recommended model ended up being approved by FAA. It was determined to be a reasonable projection of activity for master planning purposes. And I know you all have been dealing with the effects of COVID in sort of development and planning world real time. And I think FAA during the COVID period and even in the couple of years since the recovery, FAA puts a sort of a big caveat on forecast approvals and just acknowledges that there's a lot out there that may not be anticipated, but that's acceptable. The growth rate that we ended up with on aircraft operations was modest. Annual growth less than 1% a year over the next 20 years, and actually a slight decline in based aircraft numbers. The forecasts were approved by FAA in November last year, and the result of that was a critical or design aircraft of a medium large business jet, which corresponded to runway design code C2. And I would note that C2 designation, which also sometimes shows up as an airport reference code in the prior master planning, for example, that designation does not represent a change from the last master plan. So no change in design aircraft category. Ultimately, the model that was recommended and approved by FAA was a population-based model. And this is kind of rough grade indication of economic population activity as a driver of airport activity. There's no attempt to make any sort of statistical correlation between the population data and the underlying airport activity, but it was the general expectation that as an area or region, in this case, county population, both Marion and Clackamas County population changes over time, the expectation is that will drive more economic activity, which will drive airport activity in general. It's not perfect, but it's a reasonable approach when there are other factors involved. Again, this growth rate corresponded to what the FAA typically expects to see for general aviation airports with air traffic control towers, which in the current FAA long-term forecast is a little less than 1% per year. There were a lot of questions about why we didn't use air traffic control data exclusively in the forecasting. And I think most of those questions came from the city of Wilsonville. And I think the simple answer is data. As Tony mentioned earlier, the air traffic control tower opened in 2015. And when we rolled into our forecasting exercise, we began with a full year 2016 data, and we ran that through 2021. So that provided us with a relatively small number of years of data to evaluate. So the activity, statistically speaking, wasn't sufficient in volume to provide to build a reliable 20-year trend. And of course, within that period of time, the COVID pandemic occurred in really the outfall of that occurred heavily in 2020 and 2021. So we began with a relatively short span of data, which was compounded by the fact that there were some serious outliers of activity occurring at the airport and throughout the system in 2020 and 2021. At Aurora, that we saw some unusual things. There was a spike in air traffic control activity related to flight training. We talked with the flight school operators, both at the airport and around the region, and they were all enjoying the business, but they couldn't in any sense say that it was going to be sustainable. It was sort of that bubble that everyone was expecting. So again, that really made it impossible for us to only develop trends from the air traffic control data that was available to us. So on the facility requirement summary, the transition is, you've all probably been through more than one master planning exercise. The FAA wants continuity. They want consistency between forecasts, which ends up with the critical aircraft designation, the design aircraft, through facility requirements, which identifies the applicable design standards, and then they want to see those standards represented in the development alternatives. So there were a lot of considerations that went into this. And I think, as I mentioned, the existing and future design aircraft was a medium large business jet in the designated code C2. The important takeaway on this is that these standards are currently in force. They are appropriate both for the current activity at the airport and the future activity. So there's sometimes a mistaken notion that the airport is expanding to meet some future need. And the reality is the forecast activity, the category of use is there now. We just expect it to grow. So the takeaway on that is that all airfield components that are used by the majority of the activity used by the design aircraft need to meet C2 standards, runways, taxiways, and so on. The runway length evaluation, we did a fresh runway length analysis that resulted in a justified length of 5,500 feet. You're just a little over 5,000 today. And this is based on the current forecast air traffic, current traffic and forecast traffic, and using the FAA's approved methodology. There's been some changes within the FAA on emphasis on this, because I think that in the past they were more flexible, if you will, on that, and our methodology that was reviewed and approved by FAA was much more narrowly defined. So that on the design standards side, the things that we identified early on, we knew, of course, reviewing the prior master plan, we knew were issues. Chief among them were the runway object-free area, and we have a host of non-standard items related to that. That would include the Hubbard Highway, which runs along the west side of the runway, almost, in fact, the full length of the runway and beyond. Parallel, and then we have Kyle Road, and we have the airport weather station, and we have wind cones. So there are several items that were identified. There are some issues. The drain field at the south end of the runway. There's an open ditch adjacent to the parallel taxiway, and so on. The question of modification standards comes up. In fact, our project scope of work originally included a memo to evaluate and develop a modification to standards for the OFA, but it was determined as the project moved forward with coordination with FAA that they took a position, the FAA took a position that they would not be issuing a mod to standards for either the current runway or a future runway. So that sort of changed our approach. We didn't really have that avenue to pursue. Again, taking the direction straight from the FAA. And what they began to focus in on a little bit more was that the airport needed to find a path to compliance. And again, compliance to the C2 design standards that were associated with the critical aircraft. Other issues that were identified we were benefiting from the work of the runway safety action team, the RSAT group, in terms of evaluating vehicle service road issues and direct runway incursions and direct access from a couple of the taxiways from the aprons, adjacent aprons, specifically taxiways A3 and A4. So I think that was factored into our evaluation. I was going to mention on the mod to standards, I forgot to mention the fact that I think that staff is dealing with this in a real world way today, and that the FAA has essentially put some limitations on the airport's improvements until the non-standard issues are addressed fully. And I think that would be an example would be the upcoming runway rehabilitation project, where the FAA is supporting, as I understand it, I'm not involved in the design, but my understanding is the FAA will support an overlay, some rehabilitation, but they will not support upgrading the runway, meaning strengthening it or reconstructing it. And that's kind of a common approach the FAA has taken at airports that are up against a compliance issue. So familiar, but the areas in red primarily are object-free area items where we've got items in the OFA that shouldn't be. And I mentioned the Hubbard Highway is probably the most significant non-standard condition we've got, I'd say, on the airfield. So with this sort of in mind, as we launched into the preliminary alternatives, we had our meeting, we had a PAC meeting and open house in June. And we came in with preliminary alternatives that were designed to address the non-standard issues and some of the other demand-driven needs that were identified in the earlier chapters. And on the airfield development side, it really came down to, again, if we go back and look at the Hubbard Highway, there was a issue, and that was either to move the highway west outside the OFA or to move the runway east. So when we came into our meeting in June, our meetings with our preliminary alternatives, that's really what we focused on. And we had some variations within that, but we had the highway shift options and we had the runway shift options. And then I mentioned the runway extension earlier. We presented options for a north extension and a south extension so we had the east and west with north and south options. And we had the highway, got the highway and the runway options. So that's kind of how we went into the meeting in June with the PAC and the public. We also entertained, and we did develop for consideration, the option of a downward push. The notion that the C2 standards we knew were going to be challenging, so we evaluated the ability to meet B2 standards. And there's some coordination between staff, ODEV staff and the FAA, and it was determined, FAA made a declaration that they would not support downsizing. So those options were taken off the table. In fact, that occurred on that June 11th meeting, and that was explained to the advisory committee at the time. So we were focusing exclusively on C2 options again. So I think we had, from our June meetings, we had fairly limited, we presented these various runway and taxiway and road options. We had fairly light planning advisory committee feedback. I think, I'm not sure where we ended up finally, but leading up to our next meeting, I think we had only heard from 5 PAC members with formal comments. So I know we extended the review time, and I think it took, there's about 7 weeks until our next committee meeting on July 30th. Some of the feedback we did receive focused, it was more general feedback. There's, as you all know, there's a lot of ongoing interest in the Aurora State Airport, noise concerns, EFU land impacts, of course, general expansion, the concept of expanding the airport footprint, just increases operations on the surrounding communities, and then also impacts on existing roads. So those were all, that was kind of the flavor of the comments. There wasn't a lot of detailed, I mean, I think it's fair to say that of the options that were presented, most of them, I think we could find people that hated all of them. I mean, it was, we knew, and we said we were being as open and honest and transparent as we could be. There are no easy solutions for this problem, and none of them are without cost and impact. So we kind of knew that going in. So as we went into our July meeting, we took the input we had, also the input that we had received from staff, and then the FAA input specifically. We had some fairly, I'd say, tighter, more focused FAA direction starting to emerge. And the FAA reiterated again their position that the maintaining the current object-free area and runway safety area in its non-standard condition was not acceptable. I mentioned the mod to standards earlier. It just is not a long-term solution. And they are looking for, they recognize that any option that the state pursues in this case will take years to accomplish. They just want it defined and start to see evidence of progress toward that. And I already mentioned the others. The takeaways on the other sort of what if you don't do anything is the airport could end up in the maintenance only mode, essentially, where the FAA will availability and primarily just maintenance related items. So a couple of other refinements that we presented at the July 30th meeting, we incorporated, as touches on what Tony was mentioning a bit earlier, we touched on the fact that addressing movement in the adjacent landside areas for vehicles and aircraft as well. We incorporated vehicle service road and lane to facilitate the movement of vehicles and aircraft outside the aircraft movement area. That was new, and of course that provided or required some additional separations, and everything sort of begins to expand laterally a bit. And then with that in mind, whether we're talking about the current airfield runway taxiway configuration or some reconfigurations of that, the impact on the adjacent east side property was becoming increasingly apparent. And we identified land areas that would need to be acquired to meet various FAA design standards and setbacks. And then we did identify, one of the concepts for property was to identify land that could potentially be acquired by ODAV through willing sellers. And that would be primarily through the fence users today, only from the perspective of if it appears it would be potentially eligible for FAA funding. If property does not appear in the airport layout plan, likelihood is FAA would not fund that. And then again, with refinements here, we're trying to take some input that we had received and try to narrow the field a little bit. One of the decisions that we made internally as a team was to eliminate the south runway option, south runway extension option. And the reasons were focused primarily on the potential impact or use of EFU zoned land. There's also some grading issues at that end of the runway, and then that, of course, would require more property acquisition. So we went into our refined options. We focused on the north extension exclusively. And then another item that we refined was with respect to the ODOT highway right-of-way on Hubbard Highway, and we built in an assumption that the existing 200-foot right-of-way would need to be maintained. Not necessarily the same footprint, but the width. So any shifting of the highway would carry with it the same 200-foot wide right-of-way. And that obviously increased, for those options where the highway shift was considered, increased the impacts on adjacent property. So we got a couple figures here just to give you a glance. You've seen these in your packet, I guess. So option 1A was the, again, this is the option where the highway is shifted, Hubbard Highway is shifted. We've got the 497-foot runway extension, which appears on all of the options at the north end. This option shifts the Hubbard Highway and the right-of-way about 80 feet to the west. And we still have impacts on the east side. As you can see, the hangar areas in sort of yellow, orange are new hangars. And on the kind of between the southern midpoint of the runway south, it really involves replacing, removing and replacing a lot of hangars. So some significant impacts there. And this graphic illustrates sort of the highway side of the issue, and the area in yellow and these detailed views. This represents the property acquisition that would be associated with this alternative 1A. And again, we typically, if the impact was small on a larger parcel, we would only look at the areas that would be directly needed. But if it was the majority of a parcel, or if it was a residential parcel that would be significantly affected, we would typically identify the full parcel. So that project, or that layout, required about, we ended up with about 43 acres of property acquisition on the side, and that also includes property on the east side to accommodate the vehicle service road and the taxi lane. And then this is sort of an illustration of the property. Again, what I mentioned earlier, the areas that are shaded darker blue with the crosshatch, that represents the areas that the property acquisition that would be driven by the taxi lane and the vehicle service road, and then the redevelopment of some of the hangar areas within that. The area in yellow is just that, as I mentioned, these are properties that would be, the real goal here is to keep the properties in aeronautical use. So if they appear on an airport layout plan as potentially targets for airport acquisition, then that would be, that would allow some further consideration of funding through FAA. Jump over to option 1B, which is again a variation. We're still shifting the highway west and extending north. In this case, the shift is increased. You can notice the runway itself is shifted, not just the highway. And we end up shifting the runway about 80 feet west, and then the right-of-way that is shifted, the highway and the right-of-way that's shifted to accommodate the OFA is about 175 feet. So we end up with significantly more impact on the adjacent properties, but we reduce the impact on the adjacent or the existing east side development areas. So as I said earlier, there are impacts with any direction we go here. Again, this, you can see the areas in yellow. If you compare to the 1A option, there's significantly more property acquisition needed on this option. I also would mention that we did not want to presume too much on the Hubbard Highway design. One of the reasons that we wanted to keep the right-of-way intact was we don't know, and ODOT has not been, they have no current plans on the board to make changes to the highway, but we would expect naturally as traffic volumes increase over the next 20 years and beyond that there may be some need to for ODOT to upgrade that highway footprint. So that's one of the reasons why when we're laying out the road for our purposes right now, we've effectively duplicated the road that is in place and the crossings, the signaled and unsignaled intersections. So again, property, a similar view. The main difference here to look for, as you can see, the bulk of the burden on property acquisition for immediate impact is on the west side of the runway. The impact on the existing adjacent hangars through the fence or on airport is reduced in this option quite a bit. Then the second option, sort of the option 1, option 2, option 1, 1A, 1B, we're focusing on shifting the highway in different ways. Option 2 shifts the runway. So it takes the opposite approach and it moves the runway east to clear the object-free area. And you can see in this graphic where that lines up with the Hubbard Highway. This, though, obviously will have significant impact on existing development east of the runway and east of the parallel taxiway. And that is, there are a lot of functional elements there that are affected by this. So on that, the runway and parallel taxiway is shifted about 85 feet east to clear the highway. So that results in no change to the Hubbard Highway, at least driven by the airport, no property acquisition west of the Hubbard Highway, and it maintains the existing ODOT right-of-way and the West Airport property boundary. So in the end, it requires about 37 acres. This is the blue hatched area on the top adjacent to the runway taxiway. Requires about 37 acres of property to accommodate the shifted runway, parallel taxiway, parallel taxi lane, and vehicle service road. So in this option, effectively you end up with a brand new runway and parallel taxiway and other facilities. And then the remaining area in yellow is as it was for the other options. So I know that was quick, but I just wanted to respect your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation. Are there questions from board members? Sarah?
I guess I'll go first. Matt and David, thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to follow up with a couple points. First, just what type of feasibility analysis was part of this alternatives analysis, particularly cost and coordination with ODOT? And then secondly, I have a question on the property acquisition on some of those eastern parcels that are the aeronautical reserve. I believe a lot of those are currently in aeronautical use, and just why not look at that in the sense of land use or zoning rather than acquisition?
Sure. I can tackle those unless, Tony, you want to jump in?
No, you go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, I'll do my best. Feasibility analysis, as you know, in master planning, it's a fairly limited analysis of design and feasibility. I think coordination, I know that staff, we participated in some conversations with the ODOT road folks, the highway people. And you know, like we deal quite frequently with such engineers, a lot of the feedback is, you know, we give us a design and we'll be happy to comment, as opposed to a plan, which we may have some opinions about. The feedback that we received from ODOT regarding the highway shift was, yeah, it's expensive. We don't have any money. But generally, there weren't any red flags. I mean, there are obvious issues with right-of-way acquisition and impact on community, all of which is subject to the hosted NEPA review. But in terms of technical feasibility, there were no issues raised that suggested that shifting the highway wasn't feasible, couldn't be accomplished. Cost obviously would be significant. On the other side, same issue. Feasible, sure. Building impacts without a doubt. Cost, massive. I mean, we're talking about reconstructing option 2, as you see on this example for review here, brand new runway, parallel taxiway. Point out that in a lot of these options, the existing air traffic control tower may need to be relocated because it's in the object free area with the shifted runway. The feasibility levels, I think as far as costs, we've been working toward a concept and some preliminary costs, but our expectation is that either the west highway shift or the east runway shift are going to be significantly expensive, and cost may be a differentiator to the extent that might direct the department to move in one direction or the other, but our impression is that they're both going to be major cost undertakings. And I don't know, Tony, could you add to that assumption?
No, I think that sums it up pretty well. And I did want to add to the latter part of the question about the current aeronautical use land. Some of the PAC feedback we did receive from the PAC was for ODAV to acquire the properties. And as David mentioned earlier, if it's not shown on the airport layout plan, then it's not eligible for AIP funding. And we don't have sufficient funds locally for the state to do that acquisition ourselves. So that's where if that property was to be marketed for sale, then we would position ourselves to be able to acquire it and bring it into the airport.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the long-term goal really is just to ensure that the aeronautical use continues. Ownership is sort of a path to that, but that's, as Tony said, the reason why that's mentioned.
Thanks.
Additional questions or comments? So I know one thing that was mentioned that I think probably could use some clarification on is if nothing is done, that I think you said we essentially go into a maintenance only mode. But my question is, much of the pavement rehab, that kind of work is also funded by the FAA. So where does that put us in that status if nothing is done?
Yeah, and I'll defer. James on the line. I can defer. He's involved with the runway project, but my understanding of the application of that principle is that for example, the current runway rehabilitation project, the weight bearing capacity of the runway is less than we would recommend in the master plan. We've identified that, but it's an example of an upgrade or an improvement that the FAA indicated to the staff that they would not support on this current project. So that's an example of rehabilitating existing pavement, sort of along the lines of maintenance. And they would apply a similar standard to a runway extension. It's been communicated to our team, staff, that the FAA will not consider a runway extension until the runway meets standards. So maintenance, you're absolutely right. Pavement maintenance is going to be ongoing, but it would be very narrow in scope, be our understanding.
And thanks, David. And if I could just add to that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Chair Stevens.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony. I just wanted to see if there's staff comment on that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add to that our planner at the FAA has responded to a similar question from a PAC member on the exact topic of maintenance only mode, and they responded with the section of the AIP handbook that states that rehabilitations and reconstructions are only eligible for elements that meet design standard or have a modification to standard. But as David mentioned earlier, the mod has not been an option for us.
Mm-hmm. And Jim.
Tony, has the FAA expressed any type of an opinion of one alternative over the other? I'm sure they wouldn't put it into writing, but has there been an expression of what they see this problem and how they would solve it?
Not, thank you for the question. Not for the alternatives necessarily on which direction they would prefer to see us go, except that they do want to see us work toward an alternative and an airport layout plan that would meet design standards, and they do need to sign to approve the airport layout plan, and it's their expectation that that airport layout plan would have a path toward meeting design standards.
What a conundrum.
Yes. Chair Stevens, I was just going to add last thing I was going to mention, and it was Matt mentioned at the beginning, our next advisory committee meeting, our PAC meeting, is on September 17th. So the path forward next steps is really for ODAV to select a preferred alternative following that meeting, and then getting, as was mentioned earlier, working through the final deliverable process to get the documents to the FAA for review. And ultimately, the airport layout plan would be signed by the FAA and the state owner of the airport, and the board would adopt the plan. So those are the steps ahead of us. The conundrum is in fact for you and staff to make the decision the best. No easy decisions here, I'm afraid, and we're just trying to provide technical input on this.
Jim, did you have another comment, question?
Yeah, you may have covered this. I had to step out for a moment. Assuming that the sounds of a project of hundreds of millions of dollars, and where in the world would this money come from, do you expect?
Well, I think what we know.
David, either one of you.
I'd let Tony take. Yeah, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I'd let Tony go ahead and take that.
Okay, a couple of you were speaking at the same time, but I think I understood the question of where the funding would come from to make these changes. Was there something else that I missed?
No, that's perfect.
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, ODAV does not have the funds out of our standard operating and other revenue sources for projects, but they would have to come from the airport improvement program from the FAA to fund those. And then, of course, our normal match requirement is 10%, and the FAA would fund 90%.
And is there any indication that the FAA expresses an opinion one way or the other that they would or probably would not fund this type of a project?
Well, Tony, maybe I'll take that one. So those of us operating airports, we understand that there are finite resources for airport improvement program projects, and there's just not enough money to go around. So if this is the initiative and the path that FAA wants us to go down with, like you said, millions and millions of dollars in investment in a general aviation airport, it would take away funds from other airports across the entire system. Because this is not entitlement funds, this would be discretionary funds. And then maybe potentially other special funds, unidentified. I'm thinking of the bill money that has we've been fortunate to have for the past few years, but that's going away as well. So Steve, do you have anything to add there?
No, that's a good perspective on it. Obviously, yes, you're talking whatever one of these alternatives, I think, and it was pointed out well along the way that all of these are significantly expensive alternatives for this size for any general aviation airport, large or small. So I think that's a conversation to have with the FAA. Tony, or back to the team. from the Century West team. I know you said that there was in June, there was the last planning advisory committee and discussion with the PAC. I don't remember in your conversation here, were there elements that they preferred? Obviously, I'm sure that most of them probably said perimeter road or some type of vehicle service road is a good idea, elements like that. But I don't think it sounds like anybody, if you're talking about ODAV selecting a preferred alternative, if there was a outcome out of that last meeting that coalesced around a direction that the PAC was feeling.
I can jump in on that. Thanks for the question, Steve. I would say I don't think there was there was no consensus that I was aware of. I think there were a lot of opinions. I think there were a few common items like the vehicle service road that that users of the airport could see the benefit of, or potentially. I think we did get some feedback on the idea of eliminating the south runway extension, because a lot of people were really focused on the potential impact on EFU land, and I think and the need to acquire more property. So by focusing the future runway extension on the north end on property already owned by the state, that made that issue, that resolved that issue to some degree. So there were some positive comments or some positive feedback provided on that. Ironically, if I remember correctly, even the city of Wilsonville acknowledged that as possibly a good thing. So, yeah, but as far as yeah, I don't think anyone was ready to stake their position on whether they wanted to. I think we could imagine that community folks might say, let the airport deal with the issue. There might be some airport users that say, let the highway deal with the issue. I mean, I think we haven't gotten a consensus. I don't really expect that we necessarily will. We're just looking for all the input we can get, and so that you all and staff can make a final decision.
Yeah, so I would
just
say
to
I'm
add to
sort of mindful that we're at time, and I know I have to step out for another meeting. I suggest that we actually put this onto our next agenda so we can continue this discussion. And my overall sense from the last PAC meeting is people are just overwhelmed because now there's a much better understanding that this is a very complicated issue, and it's much more complicated than probably any of us anticipated. And the FAA has, I will say, made it more complicated. So there's a lot to talk about and consider. And Jim, did you have one last thought before we hop off?
I agree that we should have a discussion on this thoroughly at our next meeting. What I'm really focusing on is our obligation of the preferred alternative probably is going to be money driven more than anything else. And in order to select a preferred alternative, it seems that we've got to have a pretty good handle on the likelihood of obtaining the necessary funding. Otherwise, why pick that alternative? So that's all I had to say.
Thanks for that, Jim. Steve, one last thought?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. You said pretty much what I was going to say, which is, yes, I think from the board's perspective and input, I think what you've heard is there are financial considerations, obviously, to the state, either to the Department of Aviation or to ODOT when you're talking about this. There are regional impacts to the overall aviation transportation system. If an airport like Aurora were to take on these large amounts, that has to be discussed with the FAA and what it means to the region, the whole entire Northwest region. If you're talking the types of money you're talking for highway relocations and that. The last thing, and I appreciate, Jim, your perspective on that, and Catherine as well. The last thing, though, and I think this is just a procedural thing from a board perspective, this is still a decision of the agency and a decision of the Planning Advisory Committee. I appreciate this opportunity for this, but I really don't feel that, and we can probably get a legal interpretation on this, but it's really not up to the PAC or not up to the board here to be directing the agency on which one of these preferred alternatives. I think we can give our criteria, which I think we have loudly, but selecting one is really up to both the planning advisory committee, and the citizens involved in that, and the staff involved in that, and the ODAV staff.
Yes, that's absolutely correct, Stephen. As I believe it was Tony said earlier in the meeting, because I sit on the PAC as the representative for the board. So if you do have inputs, certainly send it my way. I'm happy to get on a phone call with you. But yeah, I think going with a criteria-based approach for our recommendations as a board is the right approach. So, all right, I'm going to call this for time. I'm happy to have this on a future agenda, just if we want to talk through more of the issues so that we can really hone in that criteria. But other than that, I'm going to sign off. Thank everybody for being here today. Appreciate the presentations. Thank you, staff, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna stop recording.